Welcome to the Seeker to Seeker podcast. I'm your host Simeon, and I bring you conversations with some of the world's most insightful students of the human spirit. Today's guest is Dr. Susanne Cook-Greuter. Susanne is internationally known as the leading expert in ego development and self-actualization. She is an independent scholar recognized for her groundbreaking work in ego development theory and the functioning of language in meaning-making. She received her doctorate in human development and psychology from Harvard University. Now, I chose to contact Susanne after I read her seminal paper on the 9 stages of ego development, a paper that is often required reading in university courses in psychology. To anyone interested in how exactly the human spirit matures, this paper is an absolute must-read, and I'm including a link to it in the video description. To provide a brief summary of Susanne's work, after she studied the work of developmental psychologists, she figured out a way to measure the psychological development of a test subject by making him or her complete sentences. Susanne gave out and analyzed tens of thousands of sentence completion tests. What she found was that people not only show different degrees of psychological development, but that there are discrete stages of development, each with very specific characteristics. These stages are the same for all of us, and we all move through them in the same order. Susanne's research all culminated in her influential paper, which is as full of scientific rigor as it is of general life wisdom. I will do both Susanne and you, the viewer, a disservice if I try to provide a brief summary of her work in this short introduction. Rather, I will waste no more time to bring you my conversation with Susanne. Here, we discuss the lessons she's learned from her decades worth of work on the human spirit. Susanne brings us some real gems of life wisdom, and she also recalls experiences she's had with highly actualized individuals such as Ram Dass and Amma, the hugging saint. We also touch upon topics as diverse as the nature of language, psychedelics, the necessity for having different people at different stages of development, the interconnectedness of life. So, get ready for a rich and deeply insightful conversation. Also, if you like this sort of content, make sure to click that subscribe button, as there's plenty more coming in the future. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this conversation.
So, first thing I wanted to say is my experience with reading your paper, The 9 Levels of Increasing Embrace of Ego Development. It was, maybe I took a week or 2 weeks to read it. Every day I was reading it with passion. And then at one point I found myself at a house party where there was a group of people gathered and, everybody's telling stories. And it was my turn to say something. And I brought up the 9 stages of ego development. And I said, there is this researcher, she has ordered the different stages of ego development. And then I mentioned the broad kind of pattern of it. And suddenly the whole kind of group went quiet and everybody turned at me and they were like, whoa, tell us more. And roughly I told them about some of the main ideas of the paper. And they were really fascinated. And on the next day, a couple of my friends invited me over so we can actually talk about this paper. And so I think that's something very interesting. There's a lot of really interesting things in your work, but one thing is that it's academic, it's rigorous, and yet when you hear about it, you're not bored. When you hear about it, you want to learn more, and it strikes you as very important. So for those people who aren't aware of your work, can you give some broad overview of what your understanding of ego development is, and the broad strokes idea of the paper and what you found?
First of all, my research is based on the model of a woman, Jane Loewinger, who did her work in the 60s and 70s and on till she died. She became quite old, and she was one of the first, and actually a woman who looked at the possibility that adults also develop. And she created this theory with stage descriptions and a manual. So all of that was actually modeled for me before. I just found very quickly when I went back to school and took a course in adult development that some of the things, particularly at the upper end, I saw in responses that she couldn't explain. Her idea was that the most mature individuals have the most sophisticated self-identity. And I found that some of the responses I got from the test, because I was trained as a test scorer, actually had a different perception of mature identity, no need to pin something down, much more fluid. And that was in 1978. And then I started to collect those rare responses because I was curious. When a theory can't explain data, a data-driven theory, then, you need to change the theory or see whether there is a pattern you could recognize. And because I was educated as a linguist in Switzerland, a semanticist, somebody who looks at the meaning of words and the development of the meaning, the two of them, ego development theory from Löwinger and my whole bag of knowledge, if you will, in semantics, came together like a marriage. I mean, it was just beautiful because I could use both. And that's how I started. It took me many years before I had enough data to even make some assumptions about what might be. And the first time I presented the ideas, I hadn't even learned how to write linear essays or anything like that. I brought a big chart to the conference room and just held it up and said, this is how it all, in my idea, that's my idea, how it all interrelates. And I introduced the perspectives, the growing perspectives. And I also found that this is the fundamental underlying structure for this theory that Löwinger was missing, and that Lawrence Kohlberg, famous moral development researcher and authority, complained about. There are articles by his and some of his followers which always say, well, ego development is a soft theory, it doesn't have a structure. And so to this day, I'm perhaps happier to have discovered this logical structure behind it than about saying something about later stages. It seems more important to me in some ways that we have that. And so far, it has not been discredited or challenged in the sense that it doesn't exist. Even Ken Wilber used the perspectives as what he thought was important. So yes, that's a short story. And since then, I just have been working and writing and teaching and traveling and really harvesting, if you will, all the good that came out of the research that I did pretty much in isolation by myself at home.
And there's many aspects that I find very interesting, but I think the central one is the use of language for the tests, because I know that there have been volumes written about it. But what makes language such a good indicator of ego development? How were you able to link the two things?
Because, as you know, there is not a people in the world that doesn't have a language. There's not a child that gets socialized, civilized, if you will, into a culture without language. Whatever the language is, that is, once it's on board, starting around age 2, then by age 5, children can already do incredible things, especially today's children. My grandchildren, my 2-year-old grandchild already uses a phone and can get to some of her favorite videos, whatever, games. Unbelievable that so quickly human beings use language, whatever. Language in the broadest sense. Music is a language, dance is a language to me. They can use it, and then once it's on board, it's the main means by which we see the world and talk about the world. You and I couldn't talk if we didn't assume that we understand each other to some degree. What people generally don't understand is that it's only to some degree. You say a word, I say a word, the same word, and yet it means something quite different if we really dig in. So the meaning is assumed to be easily transferred from one person to another. I say something, I package it in a word, I send it over to you, you receive it and unpack it, and here we are, we understand each other. Not totally true. To some degree, I would say, I would qualify. Yeah. And so people's language gives you a window into what they can see and describe and parse and talk about, but even more importantly, what they cannot yet see, what's not on their radar yet. And that is how the method of ego development analyses is based on those sentence completions. You know, the sentence completion test, the little sentences like raising a family, a good boss, things like that are on a list of 36 items. And the client has to just finish those sentences, simple instructions, spontaneously finish those sentences. And from that, the way they finish, the way they react to the stem, we can tell a lot about who that person is, what they can see, what they can describe, and what's yet not there. It simply doesn't occur to them. From very simple to very, very complex, and then beautifully to simple again. Complexity, more and more and more complex, and then letting go of that. The same with the identity, more and more clear about individuation and, you know, being uniquely oneself, and then being able to let that go as well and seeing it for the illusion it is. In all ways, trying to describe reality is a, what shall I say, a very human endeavor, and inevitably fails to nail down reality. We don't know what it is. What we have is to filter through language what we think it is. But it isn't what it is. That is not being capable of being put in words, except maybe in poetry, or when you look at parables or fables. There's a touch of that that gets closer, but only closer. Never to it.
Yeah. In the East, they would describe kind of Brahman. They use the words, the one before whom words recoil. And I think this can be used for the actual experience of reality in the end. So if I understand correctly your model, I connected a lot with Jung's model, just because I'm a bit familiar with him. So Jung used to say that, you know, in the beginning, you have to create a personality for yourself in the first half of your life. And he compared it to the sun kind of rising out of the sea and gaining strength and gaining more and more brightness and power. And then when you reach the top, suddenly you start descending back to the mother, the sea, the great sea, and then you give off your light and you disperse onto the land and you return back to the mother. So I saw some, essentially, I think the same model in which earlier stages seem to build themselves up, and then later stages seem to dissolve themselves.
That's how we see it, yes. And we even describe it, and I don't know, in that paper you don't have the curved representation yet. You probably have the spiral like everybody else, but the one we most use nowadays is the arc, which exactly describes that from the beginning to the middle. There's a further and further separation and individuation in terms of having clear boundaries. I am this, not that. I'm doing this, not that. More clearly knowing who I am and what I want and where I am going. And then there is indeed a softening of these boundaries, and in a really describable stepwise fashion till we get to the other end where there is unity again. So sometimes I describe it as the baby is unified with, it doesn't have any distinctions yet. It and the mother and the breast are all one. Then it slowly learns to get away from that nourishment, from that symbiosis, and learns language and goes to school and gets socialized and becomes more and more encouraged by the culture to become an agent, a self-agent, somebody who makes their decisions. And, you know, that's the idea of most educational systems. And then sometimes when they go to college, not everywhere, but some learn to start to question some of the assumptions that we all imbibe. There's no way we cannot, when we are in a culture, get certain ideas, certain beliefs that we just hear every day and we take them in as the truth. And sometimes college or some individuals are just terribly curious about things or have a philosophical mind, start to question, is this really true? And that's the first step of loosening the boundaries. And then that happens more and more. Deeper you go, the more you realize this is all just made up. Meaningful. It's not, it's arbitrary, but meaningful, because we couldn't live without it. How would we live without language? How would we live without or some orientation of what life is about, where our ancestors are coming from, all that?
Yeah. And so in your work, you have worked with some of the later stages individuals, correct?
Yes.
Even though
Yes.
there's few of them. But so when somebody gets to that stage, how do they manage survival? How do they manage living in society?
Sometimes that is actually one. Each stage has its own challenges, and very late stages have often the challenge of how to be, if you're in any statistical sense, rare. If there aren't really that many people to connect with, you feel misunderstood most of the time. That's one of the main complaints or concerns that somebody has that might come to me for coaching or advice. The other thing is you can even get to the point where you wonder, am I crazy? I make meaning in a way that everybody around me simply doesn't understand. And the question is, am I actually off the rocker? Is something wrong with me that I think that way, that complexly? And, you know, that is often a part of the suffering at the very late stages, particularly the construct aware, because once you realize that everything you think and do about the world, what you say about it, is a construct, is an invention, it can feel like you've really lost the bottom underneath you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you can get into this tangle of trying to explain that, what it's like and what it is, and then realize even that explanation, of course, is an explanation and leads to nowhere. That can be very disturbing and liberating at some point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now that you mentioned the construct-aware stage, for example, when I began reading your paper, I had a little bit of an illusion or a hope that understanding about the stages, I would find myself very late in the stages, or if I didn't, that if I read them all, I would get them, and so I would get all the way to the end because, of course, I get it all. And then as I was reading, eventually I came upon a stage where I thought, okay, many of my characteristics are here. I found myself kind of distributed between 3 stages. And then as I progressed, I could see that I no longer, there are stages beyond my personal point of development. But then still I had the hope that maybe now that I read about them, I would understand them and that would help me progress. And then I would read about I think was the construct aware that is aware of all the theories that we have and all of that. So I read about it. I do intellectually get it, but it's absolutely not the same as me being that on that level of development. So I guess my question is that a person on an earlier stage reading about later stages could, theoretically get it, but still they don't become that. They don't change that way.
That is indeed the difference between reading about, which we call aboutism, and embodiment. Big difference. And I would say not all levels. The earlier the level, the less they're able to even intuit what's next. But anybody starting with stage 4, the sort of what generally is considered the adult stage in Western cultures, can learn any theory, from systems theory to chaos theory to integral theory, whatever theory, ego development theory, and get the ideas, as you say, intellectually. But that's a far cry from actually being able to inhabit it. So then I guess the invitation to the person is so now how can I actually live into what I yearn for or see as a potential for myself? And reading and listening and studying and discussing with others certainly supports growth. It just doesn't guarantee it. So I'm not saying people shouldn't do that. And any kind of interest that you pursue can strengthen the direction you're naturally inclined to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And another interesting thing in your paper is that it gives space and value to each of the stages. And I mean, again, I think intellectually, of course, I do understand it, but still there is this small part of me which says, yeah, but it would be so much better to progress further. So can you talk a bit more about this, about why all stages are necessary or natural, and why people at the really later stages do not feel like others should change and be more like them?
Mm-hmm. That is actually right now in the trainings, the main focus is the anti-vertical higher is better idea, which is it's become a fad. 10 years ago at the Center of Creative Leadership, what's his name? Oh, that's my age, the memory lapses. Nick Petrie wrote a paper about the trends in leadership training development, and vertical development was one of the greatest ones. And now everybody is doing vertical development, and with the misconception that higher is automatically better. It is not. No culture, no society would work if everybody was late stage. It simply wouldn't. That it takes all the levels to make a country run, to make a town run. It just does that. And moreover, the later the stage, the more people become aware of the strengths of their own earlier stages. Each stage has its strengths and its vulnerabilities, but they also all have strengths, and sometimes you need to be able to access those. There's situations in life where no matter how kind and how much you are into diversity training and loving everybody simply does not work, where you have to be able to stand up and confront somebody and say, here and no further, this is not okay. And that's very hard for some people at some stages to do. Or what we also observe is that up to about stage 4 or 5, early post-conventional, so we have 3 tiers. Pre-conventional, which is like unsocialized, like a child in the sandbox who takes everybody's toys and is just for himself. Then you get socialized in school and all the way up to university or in life through your job or whatever. And that is conventional. And then you have post-conventional, and we only see, I would say, 20% perhaps in some cultures, in Western educated cultures, reach that level where they can start questioning some of the cultural assumptions they have been brought up with. And then you have a very, very few that seem to even go beyond that and no longer try to explain their existence via rational thought and words, and getting more and more individuated. They just let that also go. They realize this is all made up. So we have 4 tiers. Most ego development talks about the first 3. And that distinction, I think, is also helpful. So you probably, from just your interests and your inquiring mind, I would think you would be at least early post-conventional. And you mentioned that you feel that you inhabit around 3 stages, for sure. Mm-hmm. And that is what we see. We never see somebody who is at 1 stage. That just doesn't exist, at least in the test. But I don't think it exists in life, because life demands different reactions, different ways of handling different situations. And so it wouldn't be actually very functional if we only had one way of responding to what comes towards us. Yeah. And I forgot your question. What was the question we started with?
No, you answered it beautifully. It was about why all stages have their right to exist and value.
And so when we talk at later stages, when we coach later stages, often the work is about integration. Let's assume you have a map, a test, that has only post-conventional responses, maybe a few at the stage just before, and everything is above. In a real beautiful effort to try and see oneself as very evolved in ego development terms. Then the work is really to integrate the earlier stages for 2 reasons. For yourself, because they actually have power and wisdom in them. And for especially also for compassion for others. How can you live with yourself if you're sort of on an elevated place looking down on the rest of the world who is not as evolved? Doesn't work very well, doesn't seem very mature, does it? Mm-hmm. If you feel superior in that way. So then integrating, coming to feel deep kinship with all the levels, with all the people, is far more to me an indication of being a mature, wise human being than just hanging out on the later stages.
Yeah.
Being ordinary. How do people, and that's a tough question we ask, how do you deal with your ordinary self, with your having to sleep and eat and make a living and poop and so forth? Just ordinary. And you'll have to die no matter how evolved you are. This fundamental mortality of human beings is so far a given. How do you deal with that unless you can access all the levels? And imagine that even if you're now in the middle of your strengths and ages, like around 40, 50, you're really at the top of your game, but maybe when you're 80 or later, things will fail. Suddenly your mind won't be as agile. Or your mind is, but your body doesn't cooperate anymore. It seems as if these were separate things. But the experience, the awareness, the consciousness of one's body failing is hard, or one's mind going. Very interesting experiences that most people who take tests they're not yet there at in that phase, so they can't even imagine it. It's all upward and onward. And that's, of course, a Western motto as well. Bigger, better, faster. All of that.
Yeah.
But it's questionable.
And well, when I was reading your paper, I was really surprised because I did not expect to read about such things in an academic scientific paper. I had come from the kind of field of, reading about different wisdom traditions, about spirituality, about personal development, and so on. And then suddenly I find these ideas. Before I was thinking that this is kind of a separate interest that some people have. Compared to, let's say, the interest in scientific discovery. So, for example, some of my friends, they study the different sciences, they're very much into them. It doesn't seem like spirituality plays a big part in their lives. So I just assume that that's just one of the many interests you can have. But now as I read your paper, I find many of the ideas of different spiritual traditions, such as the no-self idea. I find these ideas in your work. And so it makes me curious whether these people at later stages, is there any relation between being at a later stage and being interested in spiritual teachings? Is there any relationship to interest in religion, to mystical kind of, tendencies of thinking? Is there any relationship?
I think some people are naturally inclined that way. Like a separate line, we can, be musically inclined or rationally inclined or mathematically. I think there is something like, and I don't know whether it's a philosophical inclination, asking about the underlying realities or how we make sense, or whether it is a spiritual line. What we do see is that because later stages are more open, naturally more open, we've talked already about boundaries loosen, there's more curiosity, there is more, I want to find out, I'm going to start meditating, I want to see what this is all about. I've read about these marvelous experiences people have, or drugs, or whatever they do to expand their mind or their experience. Going on a trip is really a good metaphor for exploring something new, different. And that can help, but what I also think you don't need spiritual ideas in order to mature enough to come at least to construct aware, or even further, just to see this is all made up without a spiritual explanation of why that is. So I'm not sure in this area, I'm really not sure. There's some people totally convinced that it's, that it automatically leads to consciousness beyond ego development, beyond the self identity. Some would say you have to kill the ego, some Eastern traditions and some Western schools of spiritual training, have that idea. And I think that, to me, that is not possible. You cannot kill the ego. You can have a new relationship to it. You can see it for what it does. The enormous work, it's enormous effort always to tell a coherent story about why I'm here and what I'm doing and where I'm coming from, and not just individually, also as whole groups, we have these stories that we share. Because otherwise we would go nuts. If we each had a separate story and nobody knew why we're here, imagine that. The ego needs to do that storytelling. And it will trying to make sense of the most unlikely things. If you ever been to an insane asylum and listened to somebody talk about their experience, for example, that the skin, under the skin, there are thousands of ants that drive them crazy. That is an explanation for their experience. It seems insane to the rest of the world. But from a purely descriptive place, experiential place, that is what it is for them, and that's the only words they have to communicate what they are feeling. And the whole issue, it's again a boundary issue between what is sane and what is insane, is of course an artifact. Somebody decided which one is which. But there's really no way to say what is sane in some contexts is quite insane in others. Just think of global warming or the kind of Anthropocene that they call now. I have to laugh in our country now when we say the new normal. And I always want to say it was never normal in the first place. It was always so much taken as assumptions about what the world is like or how economies work. That is actually quite insane in the traditional sense of sanity and insanity. It's not helpful. It's not life-sustaining. It's not beneficial other than to a very few, let's say our economic system, capitalism, or other economic systems. It's really, if you go underneath, you find a lot of what you could say is not normal, not sane. And yet it's being sustained for centuries. So interesting, as soon as you start playing with the meaning of words, you get into very interesting territory.
Yeah. And, well, this gives me many questions, but let's say one of them is, I think, I'm not very familiar with Ken Wilber's thoughts, but I think one of his ideas is that collectively we have been moving through the different stages. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that in his view, newer and newer stages have developed as humanity has evolved. And well, my question to you is there any way we know, do we think we know whether humanity is collectively progressing through the stages, or is there always some arbitrary distribution of people through the different stages?
I am actually not sure about that. I somewhat disagree with the certainty with which some integralists, including Ken, assume that we're automatically, the whole world is on this trajectory towards higher consciousness. It seems to me, just watching around me, that the counter trend is just as big. The more things get complicated and complex and difficult, the more there's also the development or going back to earlier stages, if you will, as a counteraction, as out of fear. Fear is such a human the fear really of death, of non-existence, is so huge. So much of what we do is to avoid looking at that. Whole big theories, whole wonderful things that we do in order not to face the fact that we're not permanent, that we're not that important. That's tough to take. So there's all these beautiful theories that assure us we either get to heaven if we're good and nice, or we get to be enlightened if we're just doing the right things. I just don't know. Yeah. And I do think, and I do have experienced people who I would say are not just wise and compassionate, but in some ways have access to something that we could call enlightenment. A way of being that is sustained, not just temporarily accessing, but really sustained, like the Dalai Lama. Of all the years I've listened to him or seen him, he's been consistently the same, totally boundaryless, open, caring, intelligent human being. And then there are the frauds, those who think they're enlightened, but in some ways they're not, they do damage. Yeah. And the eternal hope of us all to find something that will give us hold and that will give us some security about being alive and being here.
Yeah. So when you said that you don't necessarily see a relationship between later stages in spirituality or any kind of belief, I'm reminded of the Buddha, actually, the historical Buddha, and the way that he essentially preached a philosophy of understanding life. And he continually was forbidding his disciples to tell stories about him, to tell stories about miracles, to ask questions about other lives or about, the nature of the cosmos. He was, again, just focused on this understanding, I think, which is kind of a unitive construct of our understanding. So I was reminded about that person, and I was curious about the people that you've met whom you consider to be at such a later stage. You mentioned me in emails that you've met Ram Dass, which is incredible because I'm really a big fan. I've learned a lot from listening to him. And so I was curious if you are willing to tell me about that meeting and maybe in general about such people that you've met.
I've met quite a number of what's called gurus, what I call the real thing. And each time it has been mind-blowing. The difference between what an ordinary person has access to and what they did. So twice I met Amaji, but have you ever heard of her? The hugging saint.
Yeah, I've heard of her, but I don't know much about her.
It's very small, even I'm short, and she's even short and more this way than I am. And when you go the first time, you get into a long line, several hours long line to get to her, and she sits in a chair and you kneel a little lower than she. And when I finally got there, maybe at 1 a.m, after all evening, all she did, she put her hands on my head and sung me a hummed a lullaby from my childhood. Can you imagine? The whole idea, rationally thinking, where on earth did she draw that melody from? How did she know? Without words, she didn't say a word. Wow. She just hummed that song. So yes, there is something about some individuals which is so fundamentally different from the ordinary way we make sense of things or the sources we have access to, that I would say, yes, there is something beyond that. I just don't quite know what it is, and I refrain, because I'm at heart really a scientist, from speculating. But I would certainly not deny it and say it doesn't exist. I just don't understand it or know it, and I'm attracted to it too. It's magnificent. It's beautiful, a moment like that. Same as Ram Dass. We happened to winter in Hawaii, on Maui, for several years. And I discovered that he has a sendo there, not a sendo, what do you call it? An institution there, a place, it's actually called the Death Door, where he and several others and his entourage did their work. And through somebody else, I got invited to go to a beach day. And so there was maybe 25 people, him, some of his students, and his helpers. As you know, he was already in the 80s, I think, then. He was seriously handicapped. He had a hard time talking, and he was carried. He was in a wheelchair. And then they created, on a beautiful day, they created this place on the beach where they put flowers in the water and put him onto kind of a rubber float. And there he was in the water in the beautiful day in Hawaii, in the tropics, so to speak, floating, and the people around them. It's just totally ideal. And then he went back to the land and was resting there, and I introduced myself. And all he did, he was sort of semi-recumbent. He took my head, put it on his chest, and that's it. And it was, again, blissful. That's actually a pattern almost. That it was, I don't know, I just felt so at home, so seen, and so unnecessary to be seen. Seen as me, just seen as a soul or a human being or a beating heart, because I could feel his, and the way I was on, sort of leaning on him. He pulled me down to him. I felt that way. Very fascinating. And then we went out to lunch, and he was curious about ego development. And so I explained a little bit, and he hadn't read before. He was a very well-educated person anyway. And then he said something that to this day I kind of smile. He said, well, you know, my attendants and my students are mostly nowhere near. I can't talk to them about these things. It was fun, and I felt a little embarrassed when he said that, because it was judging very quickly. But they're beautiful people nonetheless. Some of them, the service they do just to help him. And now he is gone, of course. But those kinds of experiences very much enrich one's life, and perhaps also a bit one's understanding. Yeah. And one's appreciation. And that's another thing that in contrast to trying to explain everything, accepting some mystery in life, things we just simply can't, they're there, we have the experience, and yet we can't explain them. And we don't need to. That's where your question starts. We don't necessarily need to have an explanation. We can just accept it as what is a gift, maybe. But it doesn't need to have a spiritual explanation of why it is there and what it is.
Yeah.
But just my perception, that others have very different ones.
And when you mention Ram Dass, this brings another interesting question, because before he devoted himself to Eastern spirituality and all of this, he became famous for being in the psychedelic drug scene. And
absolutely, and ruffled many feathers.
Yes.
And he wasn't particularly a skilled human interactor either, I think, in his early years. And then he had a stroke too. I always wondered how that deepened his perspective that he already had. Be Here Now is written before the stroke. That's a book most people first encounter him through. And that is already very much like the voice of somebody who has a deep spiritual understanding of life and existence. And it only, I think, deepened when he had a stroke and became dependent on other people to actually help him get through the days and through the nights. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah. I have heard that now scientifically, there's the different what was it, the model that models human behavior? There is openness, conscientiousness, and I think it was the Big Five
model. Yes.
Yeah. And as far as I know, psychedelic use has been linked to long-term increase in openness. And I was wondering whether you have learned anything about how the use of psychedelics, how it fits in, and whether it fits in with ego development, and in general, what your views are on using psychedelic substances as a form of inquiry and development.
If it's well organized, well observed, well supported, I wouldn't recommend you go out and find yourself some psychedelic mushrooms and try it out, or ayahuasca or something, without people who really know the effects of all of this. Why not? For some people, it seems to be helpful. For some conditions, it seems the research so far as we have, the little we have certainly in the West, or here in America, it's still, very few places even have maybe one or two institutions or departments where they study the effects of drugs, of hallucinogenic drugs. It's still pretty much a no-no, and it's on the sidelines. People do it, but, in secrecy behind the thing. It's not but I hope it will change, because they can expand the mind. And with both ways, I always think people have this fantasy that it's all beautiful and all wonderful and all, oneness experience. It can also be Bardo-like, where the Tibetans described where the demons come, and horrible experience you don't have with your everyday consciousness, the awake consciousness. And that too can or cannot, it can now terrify you and stop you and even make you go backwards in development, or it can expand your mind and your experience and your heart. It all depends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I certainly wouldn't say no. I mean, to exploring that for its benefits.
Mm-hmm. And well, now that I've read your paper, it just gives a different perspective of looking at people. So, for example, I have a younger brother who is 6 years younger than me, so it is naturally he hasn't had some experiences that I've had and so on. So it's not a matter of opinion. It's natural that in some instances he is less mature than myself, and it's easier, now having read this paper, to look at these differences at maturity and, yes, cultivate compassion.
Right.
So I was wondering how you have been affected by your work and how it has impacted your life and way of living and seeing the world.
As I said earlier, I suppose I was brought up in a very elitist, humanistic type of environment where, in general, I think those who get selected to be in that system because they're smart and gifted, develop earlier So they can be post-conventional even in a teenager age. But that's the exception, and it's part of that particular school system I grew up in. And I don't even know whether it's still like that. Because there is something about the critique of elitism. And, you know, if you select quite early at age 12, you select people into different streams of education, where some get the best and the most intellectual and creative kind of education, and others learn a trade, and the third rung doesn't even do that. There's some question about that. You know, is that equality? How do we? So the Swiss, as far as I know, have started to level things out as well. And I don't know whether that serves or doesn't, but it's clear that we were very early on able to think in more complex ways and talk and behave in more complex ways than most of our peers, I say, in the teenage age. And some of it is really just maturational. We know that the brain isn't ready, fully developed till early 20s. And now sometimes we even talk about the new age between adolescence and adulthood. This is sort of an in-between, where you're, yes, adult, yes, you can vote, but you're not fully mature yet. It's sort of between 20 and 25. So it's fascinating. And again, if it increases your compassion for those who are not at the same place you are, that's really a beautiful thing.
Yes, it does. And it also makes me think about just the process of waking up, because initially, as I was getting introduced to this, I thought that this was just an idea from the East and it's peculiar to them. But now the more I find integral thinkers and just reading comparative philosophy and religion, I find that this is widespread. But now also recently, through your work, I find that, you know, waking up can be quite apart from growing up. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about this, because certainly for me, I didn't distinguish between them until very recently. And so can you talk about the process of growing up and how it's related to waking up and what is involved in it?
As I tried to say earlier, these are areas I'm not sure about, where I'm just sort of exploring, is that it seems when we look at different ego development, again, the tests, because this whole theory comes out of what people have written. It's an evidence-based test. It's not that somebody had an idea and then tried to measure it. It's the other way around. The measurement brought data that then made the thinking change, the interpretation of what we see change. If we look at that enough, there does seem, and it seems cross-culturally so, that if you interview an Aboriginal wise man in Australia, his ideas about what the world is, they come sort of together. The more conventional, the more apart the ways of how the world is seen are, even just between a collective and an individualistic culture, very different. But the later the stage, the more people seem to experience things similarly, discover similar things. And so I'm not sure whether that is spirit at work, as some would say, or what it is. I know that that some people are, let's say, a devout Christian who is very conventional. It's just as beautiful as somebody who has experienced transcendent moments. Just, have you ever seen a devout person in church? You go to a cathedral, particularly again in Europe, and you know that there are centuries of tears and laughter and joy and struggles embedded in the walls. You go in the room and you feel it. That kind of experience, again, I don't know whether it's religious. It's not a religious experience. I'm not even a Christian in that sense, but I'm still affected by what's there. And I sometimes actually miss it here because it was so uplifting in a way to be in a place like that. So I don't know. It's mysterious to me. I often end up in the mysterious place. Life is a mystery. Why we're here is really a mystery. I don't see necessarily a purpose, and that's a interesting thing. If you're more like a skeptical person, like I am, then everything seems questionable. Every certainty seems questionable. It doesn't deny, it's not cynical, because it doesn't deny the possibility that it might be true. It's just not yet. And perhaps it's the individual, because I haven't experienced it as finally true. I'm in a Zen Sangha, and I work with, so yes, I do understand, like you said, I totally understand nothingness, and I think, not totally, I understand some of that, emptiness, fullness, all of that, but have I experienced it to a degree where it convinces me that I'm not making most of it just up? Not sure.
And is there an underlying intuition, though, in yourself? I know that you can never verify anything, but is there an intuition that in the end of the day you follow? An intuition that there is something there?
The intuition or the stance that I think I'm still taking is that I can't know, I won't know, and it's a grand experiment to live and see what happens.
Yeah. Well, that's a beautiful way to embrace life, I think. Yeah.
And the sort of the basics, to be sensitive to beauty, truth, and goodness. Even so, I also question, well, to define good, we obviously have to have the opposite. You can't have good without its opposite, evil. So what play are we doing there? What game is that? But there is an intuition for me towards the good, towards the beautiful, and towards the true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Susanne, I don't want to take too much of your day, but it's such a pleasure to speak with you. Is there any other aspect of your work that I didn't ask, we didn't touch upon, but that you think you'd like to talk about? You think it's important to talk about?
No, I don't think we have covered, at least as I can think of right now, many aspects of what is important to me, what I at least have tried to be and communicate to others, help people understand, with the caveat that then I shouldn't say that you can never cut out. But sometimes this whole thing of, am I really just barking up the wrong tree? Is my life indeed, is this really a worthwhile thing to have done? Or am I misleading people? Give them a false sense of something. How would I know? I don't. I put all my eggs, we say in English, into that one basket, because it gives me so much joy and energy and fascinating encounters and travels. But I'm not sure.
Well, I know you can never convince a skeptic, but there's at least one thing that's good, and it's that so many people are naturally resonating with the ideas presented in the paper. I mean, it doesn't, when somebody hears the ideas, like for example, my friends, when I gave them an overview of your ideas, they were suddenly hooked because it seemed to systematize something that we all kind of think we know, we have some ideas about, but we see the different pieces, but then this paper puts them all together.
And that is an advantage. That's a benefit of a fine theory, is that it can do that for others. It can be, and to me, it's like sowing seeds. And then somebody else can refine it. You, the younger generation, I'm sure you have your own experiences on the world that it is, will need new interpretations of what humanity is, what it means to be a good human being, a wise, compassionate human being, given the new circumstances. So that would be something that makes me feel good if at the end of my days I can know and feel that I've sown some good seeds, some that sprouted, some that came into blossoming. That would be lovely.
Yeah, well, my generation certainly has our work cut out for us, but people like you have left us some really, really strong legacy to work with and develop. So yes, again, I deeply appreciate your work and also your time to talk about it. Yes.
Yes.
So,
blessing on all the young ones who have to carry forward.